This is about what it's like to be a voiceless child in an abusive home, and how generational child abuse and trauma have become defining parts of our nation and a serious public health problem. A problem impacting all of us in every institution in America. This information is unfamiliar to most of us, mostly because it's an uncomfortable topic. A topic that is rarely spoken of or reported on in the media. Unless the child has died or something terrible has happened. No one wants to talk about a molested child or a preteen mom with no parenting skills, a violent boyfriend, and a drug habit. Or that over 2.5 million children and adolescents have been born to 17-year-old and younger girls in America. Did you know that 13 states have no minimum age for marriage, and in some of those states a minor spouse cannot legally divorce, cannot legally leave her abuser or enter a shelter to escape rapes and beatings? Or that in 27 states, parents can withhold common, life-saving medical treatment from their critically ill children? These are human rights violations. America is the only nation on the planet to not have ratified the United Nations Rights of the Child Treaty of the 1980s. When we do talk about child rape and child death, we often use soft language and obfuscation with words like underage marriage instead of child marriage, or we often say child maltreatment instead of child rape and child beating. Imagine what it is like to be beaten or raped as a 6 or 8-year-old child, or watching your mother, sister, or brother being beaten or raped in the home. The trauma of child rape lasts forever and is responsible for frightening and often violent behavioral problems as the child ages. When these painful realities and terrible truths remain unspoken, they will continue to happen in the home. If there is no perceived problem in that community, there will be no perceived need for a solution. Because of our willingness to provide inadequate protection and healing for at-risk children, generational child abuse and trauma have festered in multi-generational families for years. And now generational child abuse is an epidemic like polio or other public health crises. In a recent study at Washington University in St. Louis, 37% of American children are reported to Child Protective Services by their 18th birthday. Did you know that 80% of children aging out of foster care lead dysfunctional lives, and that 20% of children aging out of foster care become instantly homeless when they age out? And now, over 30% of American youth are arrested by their 23rd birthday in America. A guardian ad litem case boy I'd come to know very well, let's call him Tom, he told me one day he was going to commit suicide by cop. I had no reason to disbelieve him, as he had tried to kill himself a number of times already while he was a case boy in the guardian ad litem program. The first time he tried to kill himself, he was 7. Before I became his guardian ad litem, Tom had been tied to a bed, sexually abused, beaten, and starved for 4 years. Tom's father had had a court order forbidding him to be around children at the time he was sent to prison because he had been arrested for molesting children in another state. That court order was overlooked or ignored. Tom had 2 brothers. Both of them were state wards also. Tom's mother and father had experienced the same kind of horrible childhoods they visited upon him, and each of them had spent the majority of their adult lives in prison. When Tom was born, he immediately became a state ward when his mother gave birth to him in prison. Dad was let out of prison early when he requested and obtained custody of his son. It never should have happened. By the time Tom aged out of foster care, he had cost the state about $3 million. Now that doesn't include any consideration for the teacher he beat up so badly that she quit and sued the state, or for the stabbing of another student, or for any of the terrible things he did to the 29 foster families and group home people that he lived with while he was in Child Protective Services. Tom was with me for 14 years. He contracted AIDS at about the age of 14. If he is still alive today, he would be about 26 years old, and I expect he is still a state ward and one of the 80% of aged out youth leading dysfunctional lives. And he's probably one of the 80% of recidivism inmates in the criminal justice system. Some years ago, one of my child protection judges handed me multiple pages of 6 to 12-year-old children forced onto Prozac-like drugs that were taken as they passed through her child protection courtroom. She was deeply concerned and had been tracking the overuse of drugs in her courtroom on children for years. Did you know that today about a third of America's foster children are forced onto Prozac-like drugs to control their violent behaviors? Few of these children find the help they need to heal from the traumas of sex abuse and violence and tortures inflicted on them in the birth home. Psychotropic medications have serious side effects, and they are genuinely hated by most of the kids forced to take them. When 7-year-old foster child Gabriel Myers decided to suicide by hanging in Florida, he left a note that could have been written by an adult about how he despised the drugs he was being forced to take. When 6-year-old foster child Kendria Johnson suicided by hanging from her bunk bed not far from where I live, the police and coroner both were quoted in the newspapers saying that this must have been an accident. They didn't believe 6-year-olds could hang themselves and die by suicide. But Kendria also left a note about how she felt hated and worthless. And unless you know these drugs, and unless you know what the suicidal ideation warning on every package means, you might think I'm exaggerating about child suicide and self-harm. I'm not. Ask anyone that has had the experience. They will tell you that suicidal ideation means unstoppable, fully formed suicidal daytime full-color dreams exploding into your mind without any way for you to stop them. Imagine being 6 or 7 years old and having these daytime terrors. Remember that foster children already suffer from despair and depression and feelings of worthlessness and uselessness. Self-harm by children as young as 3 in child protection is common. Cutting and other physical self-harm redirects the relentless mental duress that fills so much of every foster child's day. The rest of us know little or nothing about these children until they make the paper. And they don't make the newspaper until something horrible, like suicide or murder, forces itself into the media. Did you know in 2014 America put 20,000 1- and 2-year-old children on Prozac-like drugs? At the same time, America fined big pharma companies billions of dollars for illegally selling those drugs to pediatricians for use on very young children. $1 billion is still a rounding error to big pharmaceutical companies, and the numbers of foster kids on those drugs have not changed much since 2014. Now, before I tell you my final story, let me tell you about how all of us can make a change for these kids now. We the people, we the voters, we the service providers and decision makers can become a voice for at-risk children. We can embrace and advocate for the trauma healing models of the medical community's ACEs approach to mental health. Adverse childhood experiences and healing, rejecting the centuries-old punishment model that has brought so many American children and so many American communities to ruin. Filled prisons, broken schools, and a great sadness in so many communities. 2 very readable books about this that clearly explain the critical information that I've talked about today will give you a profound and better meaning and better understanding of my talk with you today. The first book is The Deepest Well. If you can remember that, get it at the library. It talks about communities and the mental health issues that we're talking about. The Body Keeps the Score makes it a very personal approach. That book, The Body Keeps the Score, tells how the body actually remembers trauma. These books provide decades of research and a powerful argument for the ACEs approach to healing and abuse and ending generational child abuse and the punishment model that have made it part of our public health problem. This last story is why I do what I do. A few years ago, I lobbied a very important political figure for mental health services for state ward children in my community. I was unceremoniously told, no way, there is no obvious need, no obvious problems, and most of all, there is no constituency for what you are asking me for. In other words, she was telling me that these children have no standing, they have no voice, they have no lobby, and the problems you are speaking of are not recognized in this community. It was an unhappy meeting. I ended the meeting with telling this person that our state had spent $1 billion for transportation, $1 billion for a football stadium, and how we had spent $1 billion for a bridge that fell in the river because we didn't have $5 million to maintain it. And that these children were our future and they deserved mental health services that they so badly needed. Now, the good news is a few years later, another nonprofit director asked me to lend my voice to that same politician for the same mental health services. And of course, I said yes. And during that morning, the newspaper showed up with articles from the Hennepin, Washington, and Ramsey County sheriffs threatening to sue our state for not providing timely mental health services for the people in the squad cars and jails those sheriffs worked with. I showed that politician that newspaper article and used that argument that if the sheriffs can sue for not providing timely mental health services, perhaps we could too. And being on the wrong side of that argument was a bad idea. The happy part of this story is that this politician then understood what we're talking about and took the rest of her career in politics to really help those kids. And it did work out, and we are doing more for them. I've come to believe that it's not that people don't care. It is that we don't know. We don't know because there is little transparency, almost no reporting, and the media doesn't get involved unless the stories are horrific. Did you know there are 3 million calls representing about 6 million children that are reported to Child Protective Services every year? About half of those cases are investigated. It is worth repeating that about a third of American foster children are forced onto Prozac-like drugs to control their behaviors. 60% of the youth in juvenile justice have diagnosable mental illness. Half of them have multiple severe and chronic conditions. And according to Minnesota's former Supreme Court Chief Justice Kathleen Blatz, about 90% of the youth in juvenile justice have come through Child Protective Services. The judges quote that the difference between that poor child and a felon is about 8 years, works well for girls also. The difference between that poor child and a preteen mom with no parenting skills, a violent boyfriend, and a drug habit is about 8 years. A public that knows the depth and scope of this problem is more likely to force their political leaders to support programs and policies that interrupt generational child abuse and heal the damaged children we see in our schools and our prisons and jails every day. We have the tools to end child abuse, we just have to put them to work. Children have no voice in their homes, the media, the courts, or the legislature, and they don't even know that what's happening to them is wrong or that what is being done to them is against the law. They need our voices. Become a voice for at-risk children. Join the conversation at invisiblechildren.org.